Okay. Comrades, you're all very welcome to this meeting of the Workers' International Network. Tonight, we're going to be discussing the continuing rise of the far right, principally in the countries across Europe. We're fortunate to have as our speaker Colin O'Driscoll, who lives in Belgium and will be familiar with the rise of the right in that country. He's going to speak in a more general way about the rise of the right across Europe and the globe. Even though Colin lives in Belgium, he's from the Channel Islands, and he used to be an officer with the international section of the British Labour Party during the time of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. This topic, the rise of the far right, or the continuing rise of the far right, is very relevant. Most recently, in Britain and in Ireland, we've witnessed asylum seekers' accommodation being burnt and attacked, and asylum seekers being attacked on the streets. So it's a very current issue in Ireland and in Britain. But in some countries of Europe, the right wing are actually in government. I mean, Meloni in Italy, in the Netherlands, the party of Wilders is in government. The most recent victories they secured was in Austria, where they got 29%, nearly 30% of the vote in the most recent elections last week in Austria. In Germany, in recent elections, in the three Länder of Saxony, Brandenburg, and Thuringia, the largest party was the Alternative für Deutschland, which is the right-wing, extreme right-wing group in Germany. They actually were the biggest party in Thuringia, and there are federal elections coming up shortly next year in Germany. So there's a huge warning sign put out to us here, and the main issues they're campaigning on are such stuff as migration, crime, and issues of that nature, and security. The party in Romania, the AUR, recently were waving banners of Donald Trump during their election campaign rallies. And mentioning Trump reminds us of the rise of the right in America, which is hugely significant. In the United States, there are several openly fascist groups, such as the Proud Boys. They've very little influence at the moment, but that can change very quickly, particularly if Trump were to be elected. But we need to distinguish in our discussion between the right-wing parties and fascism as being an immediate threat. So that's an indication that will be developed, a point that will be developed a lot in the discussion. We also need to refer to the UK, where the rise in influence of the UKIP under Farage is a threat. And the main emphasis of Farage now is on the Labour Party. He has targeted the Labour Party, and already we can see by the steps that Keir Starmer has taken that there's plenty of material there for Farage to work on. A lot of disillusionment beginning to spread amongst the working class in Britain. So we have an immediate challenge facing us there as well. And finally, we mustn't forget Russia, where there's an openly nationalist right-wing presence, even in some cases an openly fascist presence now emerging in Russia. And Putin supports such right-wing leaders in Europe as Le Pen in France, who may well be the next president, let's hope not, but could well be the next president of France. So in Russia also, there's a rise of right-wing and fascist and quasi-fascist organizations similarly. So with that, I want to introduce Colin O'Driscoll, who will speak for, how much time do you think you might need, Colin?
Oh, maybe about 15 minutes and then maybe come back if there are.
Okay, that's a good idea. So if Colin speaks for, let's say, 15 minutes in his introductory contribution, there'll then be an opportunity for comrades to speak and to develop arguments or introduce new arguments or take part in the broad discussion. And from time to time then, we can refer back to Colin to answer some of the points that have been raised. So it'll be an open democratic discussion, which will begin immediately following Colin's opening contribution. So Colin, away you go there.
Thanks very much. I wanted to start my contribution or my lead-off by talking a little bit about fascism and the relationship with the far right more generally, and also to compare and contrast the situation that we find ourselves in today with the situation that we saw in the 1930s. And then maybe lead back into the discussion about what's happening in mainly Europe generally, because that's what I know more about, and to show how that illustrates things. Because I think whilst there are commonalities between the different countries, there are different stages of we're at different stages of this process. So first of all, then, the the difference that was being drawn between the far right and fascism. Yeah, in the 1930s, we had the Wall Street crash. We had what followed that was massive austerity. In Germany, 1/3 of the working class population was unemployed, and the capitalist system was in deep crisis. That was ended by rearmament and eventually the Second World War, which broke that economic depression. We have some parallels today. The Western world, the capitalist world, has been in a crisis now since 2008 with the banking crisis, followed again by waves of austerity, attacks on working class living standards, attacks on the welfare state, and so on and so forth. This crisis, however, hasn't been as deep as it was in the 1930s and is continuing. So the 1930s crisis ended after about 10 years. We're well past 10 years now, where I think probably about 15, 16 years into the current crisis. The other major difference is the weakness of the organized working class. In the 1930s, there was still an organized mass organized working class. There was still organized, powerful trade unions everywhere, which could push back against austerity and would still in a position to hope for and to propose and to fight for an alternative form of society. This made it necessary for that working class movement to be beaten back, and that's why we saw the rise of organized thuggery, effectively, from fascism. Fascism representing a mixture of was a manifestation of the fear of the middle classes, the small businesses falling back into the working class and losing their relative privileges in society, coupled with, as people have described it, the dust of society, who organized themselves into were prey to being organized into fascist thuggery. There's less need on the part of the ruling class to do that these days, because the organized working class is much weaker than it was in the 20s and 30s. Trade union membership, for example, in Britain is about half of what it was in the 1930s. Many places, particularly in the private sector, are completely disorganized, don't have any form of union representation. We've seen years and years of attacks on the welfare state, the post-45 settlement, which has become worse and worse. And now Britain has the greatest level of inequality in income and wealth in Europe. And we don't see any end to those attacks on working class living standards and the welfare state coming from Labour. In fact, what we see from Labour is a continuation or an exacerbation of what was happening previously. Therefore, the tendency to revert to street violence and fascism has not yet, shall we say, caught the eye of the ruling class. There isn't a sizable faction of the ruling class, at least in some countries, where this is resorting to this is seen as being a weapon of choice. However, we see something similar developing. The thing to remember about classic fascism, I think, though, is that there are only two really clear classic examples of fascism with a mass movement on the ground and an attempt to transform the state to grab control of it, and that was in Italy and in Germany. In other cases, you saw hybrid regimes, the development of right-wing authoritarianism in the 1930s. So, for example, in Spain, we had the Spanish Civil War. It was supported by the fascist regimes. The Falange grew and became an important part of that regime, but it wasn't classically fascist. It was very right-wing, authoritarian, violent at times, very conservative, but it wasn't actually fascist. Similarly, next door in Portugal, you didn't have a regime that was classically fascist either. It was authoritarian, totalitarian, but it wasn't totalitarian. Similarly, in Eastern Europe, we had the regimes that came into power gradually in Poland and in Hungary and in Romania, which were also right-wing and authoritarian, but not classically fascist in the way we understand it. So I think if we look at the situation that's been developing in Europe, you can see more of those kinds of regimes developing rather than the kinds of things we saw in the 1930s with classical fascism, much more right-wing authoritarianism. I have a number of examples of what has happened around Europe, but perhaps it's more useful for me to concentrate on some of the countries that I'm more familiar with. So first of all, I suppose I'd like to tell you a little bit about what's happening next door in Holland, in the Netherlands, since the last elections. So in the last elections, well, in the period preceding the last elections, there have been right-wing governments, basically Tory, basically conservative governments in the Netherlands for about the last 10 years, which have pursued a consistent policy of austerity, deregulation, privatization of social housing stock, basically becoming more and more anti-immigrant, anti-migrant, and an increasing level of dissatisfaction by ordinary people with the state of things. So in the time that the last right-wing governments have been in power, you've seen the effective privatization of the health service. You've seen the destruction of what was at one stage a model of a social housing system, with privatization of housing, rents going through the roof, house prices going through the roof, and so on. This has led, and it has to be said, the complete inability of the left, most of the left anyway, in the Netherlands to organize any kind of ideological fight back against this, with the traditional social democratic parties going along with it, like they have everywhere else. So basically shedding a little bit of a tear about voting for or acquiescing to all of these anti-working class measures. In the last election, the largest party that came out of the elections was something called the PVV, which is the party led by Wilders. This is a very strange party. Its only official legal member is Wilders. It has no constitution, it has no structure. It won 27% of the vote. It was followed by a party which has emerged as a farmers' party, which is basically a party which is based around the idea that all this green stuff has to stop. Yeah, so never mind about polluting the rivers, never mind about pouring nitrates into the ground. I think you have some of these people in Ireland as well. And basically the two of them have allied themselves with each other, together with a split from the Christian Democrats and the major party that was in the previous right-wing coalition, although its number of seats in Parliament has fallen quite considerably. Interestingly, Wilders is not a member of this government. No one is so foul and obnoxious that even his coalition partners couldn't work with him. So he's sat on the back benches in Parliament attacking his own government. They found the guy who was the ex-director of the Dutch equivalent of MI5 to be the new prime minister, a guy called Dick Schoof, who is basically a kind of rather grey non-entity. So what are they doing in government? Well, not a lot really. Massive cuts to social programs, massive cuts to education. Some of the stuff is quite comical. For example, putting VAT on books up to 21%, but taking the VAT off of traveling circuses, this kind of thing. The biggest thing on their current agenda at the moment is attacking migrants, of course. So they've now decided that the situation with migration in the Netherlands is so serious that they need, wait for it, an enabling act. You remember those? So they want an enabling act which would allow them to rule by decree concerning immigration issues. And they're obliged to seek legal legal advice from something called the Council of State to see whether it's possible to do this constitutionally. The advice that's come back to them is no, it's not, because it's not that big an emergency. So you can do these things if you're in a state of war, if there is a major pandemic, if half the country floods. Those kinds of things could give rise to an enabling act which lets you bypass Parliament. Having a small increase in the number of asylum seekers is not a national emergency, according to this body. So they're going to try and push ahead with it anyway. And they have a majority in Parliament, but when they try to do it, somebody will take them to court and they will lose the court case. And already Wilders is talking about, you know, the traditional establishment trying to frustrate the will of the Dutch people to achieve the things that need to be achieved. So this is classic fascist tactics. You know? So basically, you push against something knowing damn well that you can't do it, and then you come back and you say, "Ah, you see, when we try and do something that was in our program, we're not allowed to do it by these people." The worrying thing, or the even more worrying thing in all of this, is that at least according to opinion polls, their popularity in the Netherlands has actually increased by a couple of points since the general election. That's the Netherlands. And if we then talk about a little bit about France, I don't know how much you're aware of the situation in France. The National Front became the largest party in the European elections, at which stage Macron decided to call a general election. He called a general election. The left managed to get its act together to produce a popular front, which got the largest number of seats. The fascists became second, and Macron's grouping, the sort of right centrists, became third. And what we've got there is a kind of classic example of Bonapartism. He hates the left. He used to be supposedly a part of it because he was a part of Hollande's last government. And instead of giving them the opportunity to try to form the first government, which is what you normally do in those situations, it's the largest party or grouping of parties that gets the first crack at forming a government, he gave the responsibility in the end to an ex-EU bureaucrat who you may know, in order to form a government which is based on the smallest of the three groupings in Parliament, which effectively is dependent on the tacit approval of the fascists. You already spoke about the situation with the AFD. I'm not sure there's much to add to that, but I think that the overall pattern is a pattern of austerity being followed by these right-wing formations beginning to form, due partly to ordinary people's frustrations, and partly due to the classic drivers of the far right. Anyone else that we can usefully mention? As you know, there's been a recent election in Austria, and the Austrian fascists are the party that has come across as the largest party. It's not yet clear what will happen in that situation because the discussions will go on. In principle, the largest party coming out of the election should have the first crack at the coalition, but the president of Austria is a Green and will attempt to avoid that at all costs, I think. Whether he gets away with trying to form another coalition, which is everyone apart from these people, we yet have to see. Since I live in Belgium, I should discuss a little bit about Belgium. Actually, strangely enough, despite the existence of a large fascist grouping, particularly in Flanders, called the Vlaams Blok. Well, the Vlaams Belang these days, they had to change the name because the original party was banned for being racist. The situation at the moment is a little bit better because the trade union movement is largely intact. The trade union movement in Belgium runs the social security and health insurance system. The right to strike hasn't been attacked, and Belgium still has a sliding scale of wages, just about. So there is indexation of wages. Right-wing governments have attempted to do things with it to try and get rid of it, and they haven't been able to. So occasionally what they do is they play around with the consumer index They play around with the cost of living index to see if they can put things in and pull things out. Another thing that they've done is they have years where they skip the indexation. They call them, index jumps. So they just say, oh, well, we're not going to apply the index this year, but it's still just about there. It's also the country that has the best, the least worse index of equality in wage, in incomes and in wealth in Europe. It's much better these days than the Scandinavian countries are, for example. And the health service and other social services are largely intact and have been pretty immune from the attacks that have occurred elsewhere. There has just been a decision to form a new government in Flanders, in the northern region, which will be a right-wing coalition, including the Social Democrats, where they will start to make further attacks on, try to make further attacks on the welfare state. What happened with the Vlaams Belang is that they got up to about 12% of the vote and have been stuck there ever since. I think because they made some breakthroughs at the local level, and I think people who saw them in action didn't like what they saw. Basically, that this was a party that was trying to play the race card in order to pursue right-wing policies, and people, fortunately, I think for the moment here, have seen through it. So there's no grounds for complacency, but I would say the situation here is a little bit better than in some other places in Europe. I'll stop there if I can, if that's okay, and I'm happy to come back and try and answer any questions or contribute to the rest of the meeting.
Yeah, thank you, Colin, for an interesting opening contribution. Thanks also for keeping to the timescale that you suggested yourself. Now, the discussion is now open to comers to contribute. You can make new points or develop points that Colin has made, but the discussion is open for any kind of a contribution. So if you wish to speak, use the electronic hand that's available to you, and then I can see the order of people offering to speak. If you don't feel comfortable using the electronic button, just wave your hand about and I'll probably see you on the screen. So, who wants to make the first contribution? I'm sure you all have lots to say. Reticence isn't a characteristic of WIN meetings. So, Jerry, you're the first.
Right. Basically, just to start the ball rolling more than anything else. Go back to basics. To me, very interesting Colin's update on the situation in Europe. As I understand it, fascism basically is based on the premise to atomize the working class organizations. So in that sense, I might take issue a bit about Spain not being fascist. It didn't have a traditional black shirt movement, but they atomized the working class movement through the 40s and the 50s. So it certainly went through a patch of that. I think that really highlights the fact there's no blueprint. It's a question of basic principles of where things are going. And that depends on perspective, political perspectives. Because from the capitalist point of view, democracy, when it works, capital is the best system possible, is they can make their money and the people vote for them. As we saw in America with the Tweedledum and Tweedledee, as we see in many European countries with Tweedledum and Tweedledee. But it's when they can no longer guarantee that will keep the power in their hands. They look for desperate alternative. We've not talked about Latin America at all. I think it's very interesting, the developments in Argentina and the Latin American countries, because we see the elements of the fascists taking place, where there is a powerful working class movement and a powerful movement for social change in those countries that terrifies the ruling class. And the question really is, where's it going? And what are we doing about it? Because until there's an alternative, there's always a potential base for these fascist bastards. I mean, the key issue of the immigration now in Spain is quite horrific, because everyone's rushing over themselves to be nice to legal immigrants and explain the terrible against illegal immigrants. And the whole thing is we want people to come in on our terms being the capitalist terms, to be cheap labor, slave labor. We can't accept the people flocking in across the river, dying by their thousands. And the tragic thing is that within the failure of the so-called left part, the Social Democrats, to put any sort of alternative, basically just tailing behind the right-wing parties, is that's leaving a basis for these fascist arguments amongst ordinary people. I occasionally watch a program on the television in Spain that's the right-wing neo-fascist channel, which they have. It's not a very popular one, but it's very instructive as the things they say. And you can see them basically rushing around trying to interview people to say, we're not racist, we just don't want immigrants around here. And then really showing how the immigrants are responsible for all the crimes that take place in Spain. And they're desperate to get people backing them up in that. And there's no clear alternative. The main people who seem to be opposing, and this is where we've got to get into the trade unions and get into the grassroots side, is that it's all a moral question. It's not a moral question when you've no housing, when there's a housing crisis, when there's a job crisis. Unless there's an alternative to that, sooner or later, and this is what we're going to face up to, however serious they are now, they're going to get more and more serious because the perspectives aren't going in the direction of social progress. It's going in the opposite direction. So that's basically the question, to understand that although there's not classic fascism, all the seeds are there waiting to bloom if the conditions allow it. And that's what we've got to try and fight for, what we believe in, to make sure that doesn't happen. You know, as I said, didn't have anything planned, just start the ball rolling.
Thank you, Jerry. Carol, you've indicated next.
Yeah, in the United States, the left has absolutely no understanding of what fascism means. And I don't think that's just, you know, in the United States. I think that's true of other countries as well. But, you know, for a lot of leftists, anything that anybody does that's bad or nasty is fascist. So I went to a discussion on Palestine, and I said, I think that although, you know, I think Trump is a fascist, although I don't think the United States is fascist at this moment. Somebody from a Stalinist organization said, oh, we have fascism already, which really basically disarms people, because if this is fascism, then, and this is the worst of it, which is bad, then fascism isn't such a big problem ultimately down the line. But I think it's good. I'm glad that the speaker made the distinction between the classic fascism and the fact that, you know, these are right-wing, a number of them are right-wing authoritarian governments. But I think that those right-wing authoritarian governments, given a much bigger crisis, the problem for most places, and in particular in the United States, is that the trade union bureaucrats essentially stopped workers. I mean, we just had a strike of longshoremen for 3 days, and these guys ship weapons to Israel. And so Biden stepped in, and Biden got the company to give them a substantial raise, but their real demand was about automation, because they're all going to lose their jobs, because Biden wants to make sure that the weapons continue to flow to Israel. And they more than happily ended the strike without having a mass meeting, without talking, without even a vote. So essentially, it's the trade union bureaucrats that are saving capitalism from having to get to fascism. But in a place like Argentina, where you have a strong working class, unfortunately, a number of those people in the PO, in the you know, the leftist parties, are not recognizing the fact that fascism is a natural outgrowth of capitalism and cannot be stopped, except, you know, for the union bureaucrats who try to do that, once that is an impossibility, because we're all going to end up in a major depression sooner than later, fascism is an inevitability. And so it's good to be able to define what fascism actually is, as opposed to just like a military dictatorship. But we can have expectations, and you can see that from January 6th, that those people haven't gone away, and those people are growing, and they have arms, and they're more than happy to support, you know, be the gendarmes of the fascist movement that is growing in the United States and is growing in everywhere. And I know that in Spain, the Vox party did pretty well, especially in the southern part of Spain. So I think that we could have expectations that there will be fascism pretty soon on the agenda, even if those particular countries right this moment aren't necessarily fascist, but the leader himself, you know, like Orban is a fascist without Hungary necessarily being that. But I think we have to absolutely warn people that this is not, you know, a century away, a decade away. I think this is really, really coming very close upon us.
Thank you, Carol. Kieran, you've indicated next.
Yes, good afternoon, comrades. I think I know most comrades, with those I don't. It's nice to meet you, and thank you very much for the introduction. I think comrades are already touching upon this key issue of what is fascism and how to fight it. I assume Roger will come in and address the topic as an author of a key pamphlet written on this topic some decades ago. And it is very important we define the phenomena that we're dealing with. And I don't think we see on the globe in many places classical fascism, and especially classical fascism, which is any prospect of coming to power. I don't think we are dealing with that. I don't think we're dealing with that within the next decade either. I don't see that as a real prospect. But instead, we are dealing with a myriad of far-right formations in every country in the globe, it would appear. Maybe there are exceptions, but few exceptions. In some places, fringe groups. But even somewhere like Ireland, Finn and Jimmy might want to comment, in the south of Ireland, where historically most commentators might have said we don't have a far right. Well, now we have far right figures in the council chambers. It's seemingly out of nowhere, a movement that appeared to come out of nowhere. In Northern Ireland, in the north of Ireland, we had an echo of what happened in Britain and England in terms of the riots fomented by the far right against immigrants and refugees. So fringe groups are present and making their presence felt in terms of violence on the streets. But in many European countries, it's far beyond that. Of course, it's far-right government or far-right parties in power or on the edge of power, or far-right parties are challenging for power. And because they challenge for power, the centre-right, the traditional conservative parties move to the right, and the social democratic parties move to the right. So it is a feature of the present era. And for me, the big question is why. You know, not what's happening. We could describe what's happening all day, but why is it happening? And that's key to all of this. The introduction addressed briefly the comparisons with the 1930s, the crisis in the 1930s. And of course, the economic crisis today has gone on for much longer than the crisis of the 1930s. But the crisis of the 1930s, in a way, was a continuation of a crisis of the early 1920s, with a brief interregnum, a brief period of boom in the late 1920s. But it's a much more profound crisis than today in terms of the impoverishment of the working class. I mean, I think that's important. We have to note that it had a stunning effect on the working class as a whole. And also, I think we do need to consider this point as to whether the working class are stronger now, the organized working class in the 1930s, or vice versa. And you know, I think as we discussed a little bit of detail, the point was the introduction that the working class organisation is stronger in the 1930s. Some truth in that. Trade union penetration has fallen in many industries in many advanced capitalist countries. But in the 1930s, in Britain, for example, we had the defeat of the 1926 general strike, so an era-defining defeat, which the move took years to recover from. By 1933, of course, we had the defeat of the German working class. So it wasn't just a defeat of the German working class, but a defeat for the European working class. And that went on everywhere. So to say that the class organizations were stronger then than now, I think is not true. That's a quick response. I could think about it more and somebody can argue me out of it, but I think it's not true. There's a huge difference in leadership. The leadership in the 1930s on paper was much to the left of the leadership in the general sense of the unions across Europe compared to the 1930s, because of the prominence of the Communist Party in many countries, for example. But of course, because of the position of the Communist Party, social fascism, the ultra-left period, etc., what that leadership actually meant was a very complex question. So we just have an historic juncture which is like no other. And we can look for points of comparison, but there are few points of comparison, I think, in that direct sense. So we have a very large working class, absolutely dominant in terms of the population in the advanced capitalist countries and most of the globe now. We have lower union penetration in most places compared to even 10 years ago or 20 years ago. We have a crisis that is prolonged, but is not the ultimate crisis of capitalism in the sense that mass impoverishment is in the order of the day for workers in the advanced capitalist countries. We have a myriad of right-wing groups which are jockeying for power almost everywhere. Not, I think, apart from a handful of exceptions, not the preferred option or the preferred choice of the ruling class anywhere. The ruling class would have a crisis, a political crisis, but they wish to restabilize their traditional parties. So in the United Kingdom, for example, the ruling class in a heartbeat will choose a restabilized, re-energized Tory party before they will choose Reform, the Reform Party. That's not going to happen, except in extreme circumstances. For the moment, of course, they lean on what is traditionally called the second 11, using the cricketing analogy, the second 11 of the Labour Party. And to me, the biggest question that hangs over all of this is not why the right are in the ascendant, but why the left are so weak. Why are we so weak? Why is the social democratic tradition so weak, the Stalinist tradition so weak, but the revolutionary left tradition so weak? And to me, that is about the historic defeat of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is a long-term consequence of the counter-revolution in the 1920s, and we still haven't recovered from it, unfortunately, a generation later. And that's why we're in this very peculiar situation where we're having this conversation, and nowhere in Europe is there a similar left development, a similar left mass party or left populist party on the verge of power. We saw that with Corbynism, we saw what happened in Syriza, we saw what happened in Spain, but nowhere currently, 2024, do we see similar developments? So it's an unusual, complex situation which poses many questions for Marxists.
Okay, Kieran, just before Nigel speaks, who's indicated, I'd like comrades to tell us a bit about their experiences in fighting the right wing in their various countries, because this organization, WIN, discusses issues of a theoretical nature in order to obtain clarity. We were all also involved in activities and struggles in our individual countries. And it'd be useful to have a look at the experiences there. Just to give the example, in the south of Ireland, which Kieran alluded to just now, we've managed to influence the Irish Congress of Trade Unions into calling a big national demonstration in maybe a month's time against the rise of the right. And the Irish Congress of Trade Unions here, which is the Irish TUC, has appointed a full-time organizer to organize within the unions to fight the right. And there's been a few seminars called by the trade union movement nationally to fight the right. And in addition, then there's a United Front organization called Lekela, which in Irish means together. And that group has drawn together trade unions, community groups, NGOs, left-wing political parties, and so on, and meets from time to time to discuss issues of fighting the right. There's been confrontations, there's been counter-demonstrations, and as Kieran said, the right has managed to get some people elected to the Dublin local authority now, which is a serious challenge. But they also lost in some areas. They were defeated by good candidates. So it'd be useful when comrades do speak, maybe to allude to some of the actions that are happening in their own countries in the battle against the right. And Kieran, we're thankful for the information he gave us in regard to the activity of the right in northern Belgium, and the successes and failures of the right-wing groups there. So Nigel, you're next.
Yeah, it's a huge subject, of course. But I think as the UK has been referenced a couple of times now, I need to come in on the UK, I think. Since the 1980s, there's been huge progress made in the UK in attitudes towards race and difference. And those figures, the figures supporting that in terms of hate crime and all sorts of other surveys, public social attitude surveys, are absolutely indisputable. The general population, I would posit, has a more progressive and positive attitude overall than the political elite. I think there's no question of that. Now, that is not to say that there's not a lot of racists in this country. There certainly are, and a lot of worrying groups, and and currently some worrying developments. Brexit was cited as, for example, that it was going to unleash a deterioration in attitudes towards race and difference, which it didn't. It did temporarily, but if you look at the trends over time, then it didn't significantly alter attitudes. In fact, trends over time are generally more positive. And there's loads of data to support that. So for example, even hate crimes up until 2023 were falling in the recent period, and certainly social attitude surveys would indicate improved attitude. So that's a positive view. What happened recently with the far right in this UK, it freed up people, the stuff on the internet, the Tommy Robinson stuff on the internet and so on and so forth, freed up people from the far right, ex-National Front, ex-BNP, those kind of people, and a few people disillusioned and disaffected to take to the streets, which they did. They were challenged on the Wednesday following the Saturday, I think it was, by the left, who came out in big numbers and pushed them back. And that's something I think we can take some pride in, the fact that the left turned out and pushed them back. I think what's happening here is that the Social Democrats, well, I'd say Liberals, the Labour Party, is now in a position where it's got, I'd say pretty racist immigration policy. The pronouncements around Palestine are very difficult because they embolden people on the right. And I know I stand on enough protests to hear the comments. Embolden people on the right. But especially the attitude towards immigration, give the right more of a voice and give them more confidence. And that's what the Labour Party is doing. On top of using the Union flag as a brand symbol, very much more publicly than before, and nationalist tropes. And if you look at the Labour Party manifesto, the chief point on the Labour Party manifesto is about service to the nation. That's their number one priority. These are very telling messages that people are receiving. So I'm not complacent, because I'm very concerned that when I look at the data again, which comes out at the end of October, I may see the trends reversing, these very positive trends reversing. And I wouldn't be surprised if I did. Certainly, I would say yesterday I was out and I deliberately stood on my own on a pro-Palestine picket to waving a flag to see if there'd been a change of vibe since the riots, really. I've done it a couple of times now, and there definitely has been a change of vibe. There's definitely been a tendency, I think, for people to make more negative remarks, confront you a little bit, bit of verbal abuse, this kind of thing. So I'm sensing, I'm feeling a change. Now, what do we do about it? Well, I think Golden Dawn, the way Golden Dawn was confronted in Greece, was very effective, using a united front method. That's the left, the anarchists, and all of the, if you like, anti-racist groups getting together and working together. Not a popular front. I mean, I think a problem we've got with Stand Up to Racism, and Stand Up to Racism, although they're, well-intentioned, they use a popular front platform. So if you go to one of their meetings, there will be zero criticism of the Labour Party. And that is a real problem, because the Labour Party are a significant problem. But if the spokespeople from Stand Up to Racism have that lack of criticism of the political elite and the Labour Party in particular, that creates a problem, because it creates confusion for people. So it's I think, just to say that trade union membership now is actually higher than it was in the 1930s. But Kieran makes a good point about leadership. There's a problem with the leadership at the moment. Our next two Trades Council meetings, one is on the definition of fascism, what is it? And the second one is, how do you fight fascism? And I think Finn and Kieran and others would recommend a united front. How we do that's difficult, because you'll get people who say, well, I'm not going on a Stand Up to Racism demo. I've no time for the SWP. Well, as far as I'm concerned, you stand shoulder to shoulder with people, and if you have some differences, you go to their meetings and you make your points, and that's what I've always done. So bringing people together is the way forward. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you, Nigel. I was wondering, Colin, if at this point you wanted to maybe deal briefly with some of the issues that have been raised in the discussion so far. Do you wish to come in at this point, Colin?
Yes, please. Just a few points. Absolutely right. I mean, I think the United Front is an absolutely important aspect of fighting these people, and I completely agree with what the last contributor said about the British Labour Party. But it is really problematic at the moment because people, see the Labour Party as being a left-wing party. If they don't know better, they see the Labour Party as being different from the Tories rather than the ruling class's B team. And it's very difficult if you're in a situation where people are not prepared to voice criticisms of what's actually happening. Because you can see that in actual fact, they've, as the last speaker said, the increasing use of the Union flag, the increasing kind of racist statements made by people like Reeves and by Starmer, and having Yvette Cooper as the Home Secretary making anti-migrant statements. Their program before the election of establishing a normal, humane method of dealing of processing migrants seems to have disappeared into the bin. Before, they were talking about re-establishing the basic principle that if you want to apply for asylum in Britain, you should be able to do so in a reasonable, safe manner. That seems to have disappeared in favour of ranting on about enforcing border controls and so on, and being like the Tories but only more efficiently. I completely agree with the idea of the United Front. Obviously, I completely agree with trying to get the trade unions involved in organising anti-racist campaigns. Some of the work that's been done in Belgium by the trade union federations is good in that aspect, although to a certain extent a little bit bureaucratic, but at least they're making an effort. The kind of mobilizations we see here against the far right tend to be, shall we say, the far right, the respectable far right, the fascists in suits, which seems to be the way that things are manifesting themselves more in this country and in some other countries in Europe, where basically they attempt to look for they tend to look for they look for the respectability and as a way of getting in the door when they're talking to other right-wing parties. And possibly what needs to be done is also, as a suggestion, is to actually take those people on politically. So Farage is not going to form another government. I completely agree with what some people were saying earlier. We shouldn't forget that they got 4 million votes in the last election. And to a certain extent, the reason they've only got a couple of MPs is because of the way the British election system works. And what's happened here with the far right is that those people are confronted directly by left parties and are confronted directly by anti-racist campaigns on the basis of them trying to appear to be respectable, undermining the basis of them trying to be respectable. Because the other thing about far right parties is, generally speaking, these people have a rather nasty history and a nasty background that they're trying to cover up. They don't appear out of nowhere. Generally speaking, they've come from something rather nasty and smelly. So if you take if you look at Italy, for example, Meloni has come out of that kind of neo-fascist MSI cradle, and a lot of the people who are around her are basically ex-MSI members, and they're basically moderating what they're saying in public because in order to gain a greater level of support. So I think there's a need for a variety of different tactics to be used against them, down from the community level, up from the community level, where you confront them when they try to mobilize on the streets, through to taking the argument into organized politics as well, in terms of discrediting them. And it's not just it's not a question of morality. It's also a question of taking on social democratic governments and neoliberal governments in general, who are causing one of the which are helping to fuel a lot of these problems through their policies of neoliberalism and austerity.
Thank you, Colin. Now, nobody is indicating at this stage they want to speak, and there's several issues being raised in the discussion so far, so it's not as though there isn't a lot of topics being suggested. So, who's next in the list? As tends to happen at our meetings, when it comes towards the end, there's a big rush of hands go up wanting to speak. So if you want a bit of time to develop your arguments, this is the time to come in. Dominic, your hand is up. Or is it John?
John.
John, right, John, away you go.
I
And then Roger.
think one of the strands that's coming through the meeting is, if you like, the position of the leadership of the Labour movement, and in that I include the Labour Party. The fact is that the more one hears of Starmer, the worse it gets. His response to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon was, if you like, a full-throated support for Israel. There was no sort of question of calling for a ceasefire, no how terrible war is, etc. No, Israel has the right to defend itself. And what's come out about the Lebanon is that Israel and America have refused to allow Israel to have anti-aircraft, fire. The other thing is about Starmer, again, is recently he paid a visit to Italy and spoke with Maloney. And the main thing that seems to have come out is that he was looking to, if you like, a Rwanda Mark II in terms of immigrants. The position is one that I think Italy has floated the idea. I don't know, and the commentary that I heard indicated it had not got very far, that Albania would be used as, if you like, a holding pen for illegal immigrants as opposed to legal immigrants. And there they would be processed. And then those who are processed and deemed fit to get, if you like, the right to stay in Britain would be accepted. But again, Stan was looking to, if you like, an extreme right-wing government, as the speaker has said, has come from a very smelly stable. And this is the real problem. The other problem seems, in my mind, to be the situation where you're getting it with the Greens of let's keep politics out of this. This is an issue that can be solved, if you like, with all sane good people of goodwill getting together. That includes, if you like, the better elements of capitalism. And the reality is that the situation we have is in a right mess, because for 14 years, the Tories were dismantling anything that was half good in British society, and Labour have done absolutely nothing to, if you like, restore that, whether it's to do with youth training, whether it's to do with, if you like, the care system, the prisons, etc. They've come up with solutions that on the surface look half decent, but when you get to the nitty-gritty and where the money's coming from to get it done, there's no money there. There is money, he won't stop arms sales to Israel. He will increase the NATO budget so that there'll be support for the Ukraine, etc. But as I say, and you're getting nothing in the trade union movement. All right, Sharon Graham will raise a voice, etc., but nothing serious to challenge, if you like, the Labour leadership. And this is one of the areas that I see as, if you like, a real difficulty in Britain today, because the response to the, if you like, the thug riots that we had after the brutal murder of those children in Southport was a real response, first of all, an act of solidarity with, if you like, the ethnic minority communities, particularly Muslim communities, in associating with mosques, etc., that have been attacked, and also with associating with hotels that have been attacked. And I think, as far as Farage is concerned, I think there's a very large section of British society who curse him because of, if you like, the exit from the European Union. And that's shown up even now with, you know, partially empty shelves in supermarkets. And people just, you know, if you like, a large section of society feel that Farage and the far right are nothing but bloody troublemakers, and that they are, you know, sort of stirring up some of the worst elements in society. I mean, my contribution's been a bit confused, but I think it is the fact that for Starmer in particular is playing around with some really bad elements and thinking that he can get away with it, the same as he thought he could get away with getting all sorts of freebies from his friends. So I think there's going to be a real battle, and I think there's going to be a battle in the Labour Party, because I think a lot of Labour Party people are very honest and decent and don't want anything to do with, if you like, the way Starmer's going. The fact that, I don't know how big the demonstration in London was yesterday, but the fact that there was a massive pro-Palestinian demonstration, the fact that you have in, particularly in Lebanon now, the bombing. I mean, I think to get rid of, what do you call it? You know, the leader of Hamas. I think I forget the figure, but it was an horrific figure. I think there was 7 tons of bombs dropped on a couple of apartment blocks, you know, to destroy them on the basis that he was inside. And the fact that there is no criticism whatever of Israel's tactics. And the fact that, as I say, he went to Italy to see Maloney about how she was dealing with the problem of illegal immigrants, many of whom, in Britain's case, have a right to come here. They sided with Britain in Afghanistan, there were interpreters, etc., and yet the whole thing has been denied them. Instead of standing up and saying, right, we're going to get things done, as the Speaker said, you know, bringing in a proper due process of vetting, if you like, claims for asylum in Britain. So I'll leave it at that, comrades.
Thank you, John. The next speaker to indicate was Roger.
Yeah, thanks, comrades. I think it's been a very good discussion, and I think Colin gave us a very good introduction. I agree with, I think it was Carol who said that we really must guard against loose talk and loose characterization of right-wing parties in general as fascist. I remember one time, several decades ago, I remember meeting an American ultra-left who was telling me quite earnestly that Tony Benn was a fascist. And if you start talking about, you know, that everybody is a fascist, then it completely devalues the meaning. We have to be very precise about what fascism means. Fascism means the utter destruction, the annihilation, the pulverization of the organizations of the working class. It means, you know, complete liquidation of the class and of its organizations. In Colin mentioned in particular the most clear-cut examples, which was Mussolini's fascists and Hitler's Nazis. But I think they were not the only ones at the time. I don't quite agree with Colin that Franco in Spain it was not really quite a classic fascist. It was more a Bonaparte. It's true that it started with a military coup, but let's be clear: in the Spanish Civil War, the Franco's agents, and particularly the fascist party, the Falange, they actually went from city to city, from town to town, from village to village, rounding up anybody who was known or was associated in any way with the socialists or the Communist Party or the anarchists, and systematically shooting them and liquidating them. And there are at least 1 million people slaughtered in Spain by death squads, by these death squads. So I think it would be a bit kind, if you like, to shrink from calling such a regime fascist, because the outcome of it was the complete destruction of the working class and of its parties and of its trade unions and its organizations, and it didn't recover for decades from that. In other words, it wiped out a whole generation. Now, that's what fascism means. So when we talk about fascism, we should be very clear. Now, the question then is, these modern far-right parties, are they or are they not fascist? Now, I would say you have to distinguish between what they want and what they aspire to and what they can actually achieve. I don't have any problem calling Meloni a fascist, or calling Le Pen a fascist, or calling the AfD fascist. I think even Farage and the Reform Party, you could say, are in the process of just becoming and forming the basis of a fascist movement in Britain too. But the point is that they all of these, including the ones who come to power, most of Europe now, you could say, are led by far-right governments from, as I've said it many times, but Sweden, with its long history of social democracy and liberalism, well, actually, of social democracy, of Italy, which had had the biggest mass communist party outside of the Stalinist bloc. You have fascists in power or in government or in coalition in nearly all the countries of Europe, and soon probably we'll see Le Pen take the presidency in France, and we'll see the AfD perhaps joining a coalition with the CDU or with elements of the CDU in Germany, and in Spain probably the Vox coming to power, and so on. These are all, or at least sharing power, having a place in a future government. All of these are there, but they will not be able to carry through, and they don't even have the ambition, they don't have the objective at the moment of smashing the working class. And let's face it, they don't have the need to smash the working class yet, because they don't pose the same threat that the communist parties and even the socialist parties in the 30s did, or at least potentially did, or had the latent power to become. So I think what we have to say is that even with these parties coming to power, they can come to power and they can't necessarily hold the power. They can't necessarily take the complete power either. I do think, by the way, in Britain, I don't think it's ruled out that Farage could come into government, because I think what's happening in the Tory party has been more or less taken over by the far right. They've purged the old kind of liberal conservative establishment. They were completely ruthless in a way Corbyn wasn't, with the opposition within the Tory party, the old grandees, if you like. And I do think it's not ruled out that you could have a kind of coalition of Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage and a far right government in Britain too. But the point is, with all of these, that could they actually carry through a fascist program? And would they even want to? Even would they even need to at this stage? I think at this stage, what's happening is they can be swept into office and also swept out of office. You saw that Bolsonaro lost power. We saw that the Polish far right regime also lost power. We saw that Modi in India, although he didn't lose power, he lost his majority quite unexpectedly, and his position now is really rather unstable, at least if we can put it that way. So I think the point is, I've said it before, but I do think we have to say that this is not the end of the story, that this is we're only gearing up for huge struggles. And the more the working class fights back and is forced to fight back, and it will be and is beginning to fight back, the more that they become a real threat, then the more the threat of counter-revolution and of fascism also will grow and take on flesh and become more of a deadly menace. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you, Roger. Pam, you've indicated.
Can I go now? Yeah, I just wondered. I don't know if Colin's mentioned this. You know how the election of these right wing leaders relates to actually the number of people that vote, because of course in this country what we were facing, particularly at the last state election, was a huge abstention.
Yeah.
You know, and a huge show of confusion and anger and lack of action. Really, people very confused, or people very frightened at what they see going on in front of them. I mean, certainly from all I can say from my own observations of being out on the streets of Manchester, that we've defeated the right wing so far, that we've turned out in far greater numbers than they have, to the point that they stopped turning out. And also with Palestine demonstrations, we've actually basically seen the Zionists off now. We haven't seen them for weeks, really. So you can see amongst there's a surge of activity going on. But I'm just interested in this thing about apathy, because to me that's the biggest problem, really. People just aren't engaging in what's going on.
Thanks, Pam. Just before the next speaker there, it's worth looking at other countries apart from Europe as well. I mean, for example, in India, gangs attacking Muslims on the streets, quasi-official government policy with a quasi-fascist wing within the ruling party. In Pakistan, extrajudicial killings of people on the streets, a religious fanaticism, which is also, of course, an aspect of right-wing politics. Yeah. In Iran, we've had a theocracy since 1979. So even though there's mass movements from time to time and trade unions and women's movements against the regime in Iran, and the regime in Iran is hated, but nonetheless, there are attacks from right-wing religious groups in Iran. And in Africa, we have countries like the Sudan with a strong right-wing influence in the divisions in that country. So maybe comrades could have a look at some of these experiences across the globe. Now, the next comrade is Denny.
Thank you, and apologies that I got here late. I'm not going to talk about Thailand and the politics in Thailand, because that gets very complicated trying to find who's the extreme right amongst army and right-wing political groups. But talking about the UK, something that helps the far-right parties very much is when the traditional political parties look corrupt and sleazy. And we shouldn't miss what's going on or downplay what's going on in the Labour Party under Starmer with the free gifts and so on, because it makes the Labour Party look sleazy. I mean, there's no way around it. It just looks awful sleazy. And they're not really changing. They're not going to back down on taking gifts. They're just going to take half as much in gifts. And the far right will take advantage of looking at another British government with a big problem with sleaze and corruption. And the left shouldn't leave it to the far right to be the ones who pick up the Labour Party on their behavior. I mean, by rights, Starmer should be kicked out of the Labour Party for bringing the Labour Party into disrespect. You know, you can't take the freebies that him and even Angela Rayner taking is ridiculous. You know, the numbers coming out is like the shadow cabinet, you know, well over £100,000 in free gifts. So I think the left has got to take a big stand against corruption and sleaze in the Labour Party in the UK as well. That's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Ian, was your hand up there, or were you waving, showing your agreement? Okay. No. Who else wants to make a contribution to the discussion? I would suggest to comrades, Israel is apart from the war that's taking place in Gaza and the destruction that's occurring in the Lebanon, is the right-wing government containing people with quasi-fascist and even fascist leanings within the government of Israel. So that's also a right-wing government with right-wing parties functioning within the country. So there's right-wing and fascist elements in several parts of the world. So comrades are free to speak. Carol, you wanted to come in again?
Yeah, I think if any country is as close to fascism as opposed to, you know, this aspiration towards it is Israel, because those, I mean, they have the settlers and in general, the Israeli population is parochial, it's self-centered, it doesn't really care about the Palestinians, it wants to seize the land. And it's not just the government that wants to seize the land, it's the people that they want to seize it also. And so their mentality, you know, they may be liberal on this thing or that thing. And what's interesting is every time somebody says something about the Israeli government, they take out their gay flag and show how liberal they are in comparison to the rest of them, those backward Arabs, while they're slaughtering those backward Arabs. I mean, I think their mentality is close to being fascist, classically fascist, as you know, Hitler and Mussolini was. But I really appreciate the fact that people have basically said that we need a united front. So whether we agree on any other issues, we have to get together in the left and beat back these people, because if, you know, part of the problem is that people don't know what fascism is. And as I said in my initial talk, that there are people who think that everything is fascism. So if somebody is a racist or a sexist or whatever, that, you know, makes them a fascist. And so they don't understand that what they're going to be facing down the road is something far more serious and draconian than somebody just saying something racist or homophobic or something like that. And I mean, I think that what we say to people is that things are going to get worse. You may agree or not agree, but right now we have to join in the united front to fight back the fascists, because they're growing, and they're definitely growing in the United States, and they all have guns. There are more guns in the United States than there are people, actually. So that, you know, ultimately the only thing that's going to resolve this is the overthrow of capitalism. But in the meantime, we're going to have to take steps, because whether Trump wins or not, I mean, it's hard to know. If Trump wins, we certainly have Project 2025 facing us, which is, you know, really as right-wing a document. It's the end of the trade unions, all civil rights, the end of the EPA, everything, the end of the minimum wage. But if he loses, his supporters are gearing up to, you know, talk about, you know, stop the steal. And we saw what they did, you know, in 2021. And I think we can have expectations that they're going to be much more adamant about, and they're already starting to, about undermining, getting rid of any democracy. The Supreme Court is completely in the pocket of Trump. I mean, we have to tell people that they're going to have to get ready, for this fight. And then ultimately, people have to overthrow capitalism.
Thank you, Carol. Jerry, you wanted to come back in again?
Well, yes, more a question for Colin in his reply, because looking at Spain, what I see is that Vox so far has not really made inroads into the working class vote. It's made inroads into the right-wing vote. And that's why its vote is declining, because the traditional right-wing party is moving more to the right, is gaining ground. I wonder to what extent that is the case in other countries.
Okay.
We see this tendency, but the fact is that there's still a strong socialist tradition, despite the leadership of the Social Democrats in Spain. But as weeks go by, as months go by, and as years go by, it's going to get weaker and weaker. But for the time being, in Seville, for instance, their biggest votes in Los Remedios, and that's where the sort of middle class and upper middle class live, which is very interesting.
Thanks, Jerry. Eric.
Good morning, comrades. It's always such an interesting conversation. It's a real treat when I can get up this early. I'm retired now, so I don't always get up at 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm out in California. Anyway, I'm going to probably just raise questions. And I'll ask, you all to forgive me for this being a little bit stream of consciousness-y, but I often feel like this conversation about the far right or fascism sort of goes past a lot of the point. And to say something in contradiction to the last speaker, so something that is quite a bit different here in the United States is the Trump movement, and I would not consider it fascist, and I don't imagine any of you would either, but it has fascist elements in it, very much. A fascist ideology sort of, stashed in the corners and things. And what we all ought to remember or understand newly, if maybe some of you in Europe aren't aware of it, is that a lot of working class Americans, particularly whites, but not even only just whites, some of the minorities too, support Trump, and even enthusiastically. Why? Well, there's an appeal to all kinds of ugly things in human nature. But the Trumpers correctly point to the fact that there's a crisis. Some things are not right in society. They're not working. Whereas our main bourgeois party, now it's really only one. It's the Democrats have kind of become the bourgeois party. The Trumpers have completely taken over the Republicans. They'll acknowledge that there's a problem. And of course, what they offer as a solution, as there was a woman there, I've missed her name, who's also American. The solutions are just awful. They begin to approach totalitarianism. But anyway, I guess the thing that I've always kind of bristled a little bit with the classical Trotskyist definition of fascism, and in counterbalance to the Stalinist, which is very sloppy and kind of just anything reactionary is fascist. It seems to me there's that at the core of it, of the ideology, leaving the movement is a bit different. It pulls in different layers, the middle class, as we know, the lumpenized layers of the working class. We all get that. But there's always this vision, this promise of a tribal, whatever it is, India for the Hindus, or here in the United States, race is still somewhat a thing, but really it's more a cultural hegemony. It's about Christianity and forcing people in same-sex relationships into a closet again, things like that. A cultural hegemony. Or for Germany back in World War II, it was we want more land, we want to expand our population, or with Mussolini, we'll rebuild the Roman Empire and you'll be better off for it. There's this vision. And it seems to me this is why the bourgeois gets on board with it, right? I think I always feel a little funny, this idea that it exists to smash the working class. It's a body of ideas, backward ideas, wrong ideas, that when desperate, the bourgeois will cling to and say, well, we'll go with this, because what we're faced with is really us being swept away, And there is a bit of a left now. I'm sure there is in Europe as well. Here in the United States, we've got this new layer of young activists, and it is much bigger than it was a few decades ago. but they've still failed, generally speaking, and our unions are moving again too in the United States to some limited degree. But the left is still failing, is not doing a very good job. And I'm in touch with a lot of the activists here in Oakland, and I work with some initiatives with them. But they still don't get that that has to be central. You know, if we're ever going to beat capitalism, we need a rhetoric that appeals to working class people, and we need to be focusing on them. And anyway, I'm sorry. Again, I apologize. This is kind of stream of consciousness, but also what it gets missed is those of us that have done some reading will say, well, we need to end capitalism, or that we need a rhetoric that articulates a vision that working class people see themselves in. Oh, that could be better for me. And that was really the difference in that earlier period when fascism took off, sadly, because people thought, oh, there's this new Soviet Union. There could be a different kind of system that I can see myself in, that my life could be better. And a lot of us, especially this new generation, I want to tell something that might be entertaining for some of you. Another spinoff of the CWI is beginning to have a bit of a moment with these young activists. It used to be called the IMT. They've rebranded themselves as the Revolutionary Communists, and they're bringing out this old iconography of hammers and sickles and red flags and things. And they've attracted some of these new activists, and they're growing a little bit. But of course, the vast majority of the population is, I mean, they're just completely turned off by it. And they're mismeasuring things like Ted and the leadership did back in the 80s. You know, they thought, well, the crisis is here. There'll be a movement in a year, and we'll storm the gates in 2 years, you know, which I don't think that's going to work that way. But anyway, the point being, they're leaning on this kind of iconography from a century ago. And it's a thing I'm kind of working on. You know, I'm not the smartest person in the world, but, you know, articulating a vision. And this is the far right in Europe and here. They spin these happy stories, or they're ugly stories, really. But it's easy to sell them to some of the population. Things were better then. You know, this used to be a Christian here in the U.S. This used to be a Christian nation, and look, everything's falling apart. And you know, that was an art, I think, in the generation of Lenin and Trotsky. They had, you know, we've got this vision for how the world can be better, and you can be part of it. Anyway, okay, thank you very much. Look forward to hearing what the rest of you have to say.
Thank you, Eric. Now, before I ask Colin to summarize the discussion, are there any comrades who want to make brief final points? Okay, so Colin, you're free to answer the questions that you have observed and listened to, and to summarize the discussion. So
I'll try my best. There was an enormous number of contributions here, and I think they're all very, very. Oh, am I? Oh yeah, right. And they're all very, very interesting. And I think this discussion could continue for a very long time, and should continue for a very long time. So I'll just pick up some of the points, and there's something else I'd like to bring into the end of the discussion, which I didn't raise earlier, which I think is possibly interesting as well. But just briefly on Spain, I wasn't implying that Franco was a nice guy, or that we should be easy on him. I mean, the Falange were a bunch of murdering bastards. They murdered hundreds of thousands of people. And as one of the contributors said, they went around rounding people up and destroying the Spanish working class. So the intention in terms of trying to draw a distinction between Franco's regime and the classical ones was certainly not to say that in any sense Franco's regime was nicer or less barbaric or whatever than the Nazis or the Italian fascists. Certainly not the intention. I think the society that was created structurally was different, but it doesn't mean that in any sense that regime or the way it came into power was any less revolting and vile and barbaric. So just to be clear about that. To what extent are these new parties supported by the middle classes, and to what extent do they reach into the working class? I think most of the support, including some of the physical support, shall we say, is tending to come from the middle classes or the lower middle classes. What's been discovered in Europe, In the UK, when the rioters have been taken to court, what you tend to discover is there's a very, very large disproportionate, excuse me, disproportionate percentage of small business owners, you know, the self-employed people, the white van men. And at the moment, at least, that's their active base, I think. Their active base in a lot of these places, and particularly in the UK, tends to be that kind of layer of people. You can also see it in the kinds of places where they've had some electoral successes as well. They tend to be poorer places, but with a predominantly white English population, as opposed to more cosmopolitan places or more mixed places. Let's see other issues. About the Labour Party, the British Labour Party's corruption and sleaze. Absolutely, absolutely. It's making people, it's revolting people, and of course, it's an absolute fantastic source of fuel for Farage and people around him, and the right in general. So it creates this environment where, you know, the left is seen as being foul and corrupt and whatever. I don't know if you've heard that the latest piece of sleaze is Jacob Reynolds, who's the Trade and Industry Secretary, who is offering £30,000 lunches. So you can have, if you pay £30,000, you can go and have lunch with Jacob Reynolds. And this is especially being made available to captains of industry. This is you know, like, if you wanted to advertise that you're for sale to these people, what better way could you possibly do it? It's absolutely disgraceful and disgusting, and of course is grist for the mill for these people. To what extent, one point that I want to sort of draw together from these different things is the situation is very uneven, like it always is, but you can see the situation coming from places like Belgium, where at the moment the right is contained, at least for the far right, at least, is contained, to situations in Ireland where it tends to be, as far as I understand, a situation predominantly which has been marginal up until recently, although there's some worrying developments with local elections, through to situations in certain other parts of Europe where these people are in government, such as, for example, the Netherlands, or in Spain, in Italy, where actually an ex-fascist is currently the prime minister. The most extreme example so far is in Eastern Europe, where the old regime, the people who came out of the old regime, the original Social Democrats, were completely discredited by their behaviour and their corruption in government. And the country in question is Hungary, where Orban has pushed the alt-right or the far-right or the crypto-fascist regime as far as anybody has managed to do anywhere in Europe. In Hungary, Hungary has passed a enabling act, which effectively means that Orban has guaranteed a permanent majority in Parliament. All demonstrations have been banned, so you can't have demonstrations. Any local authority or mayor can be overruled by central government, and basically the broadcasting and public sector broadcasting has been completely been brought under Orban's control. One of the two universities in Budapest has effectively had to close down because of the pressure and the bullying and harassment that came from the government. So that's about as far as it's got so far in Europe. Are they in a position to seize power? No, they're not in a position yet to seize power. I think, as other speakers have said, at the moment, the bourgeoisie, the ruling class in Europe, is getting things the way it wants them. So it's continuing its attacks on the working class. It's continuing its attacks on the welfare state. It's continuing to privatize, to deregulate, and so forth and so on. And it's meeting little organized opposition. As things get worse, as people have said, that organized opposition will increase. The pushback from the working class will increase. It will start to organize itself. And then you may see more symptoms of classic fascism developing. Finally, what do we do about it? I think we stay together. We continue to exchange information. Another aspect of this right wing is that, unlike in the past, they're very well organized at an international level. They talk to each other. They work together. So in the demonstration that was organized around Tommy Robinson in London, the one of the major speakers on the platform was Wilders. And they were getting greetings from Marine Le Pen and also from Bannon in the US. They worked together. Bannon actually tried to set up an international organization to try and bring them together. In Europe, in the European Parliament, they're organized into two groups, one which used to include the British Tories and another group which is further, well, normally further to the right. But it may be at some point in the future that those two tend to come together. And so they're not, whilst they go on about, a glorious national past, in all of these cases, they're quite prepared to work together and to exchange ideas. And as a left, we need to do the same thing. We need to be internationalists, as always, and we need to be aware of what's going on in other countries, and also what people in those other countries are doing to fight back against these people. Thanks.
Yeah, I want to thank you again, Colin, for your contributions to the discussion, to the meeting, and your couple of interventions. I want to thank all the comrades who spoke. I think it's been a very high level of discussion, but like all discussions of this nature, it's only a stimulus to further study, to further debate, to further reading, and to further comparisons with the experiences in the various countries. So thank you all again for your contributions. Thank you, Colin, for your opening contribution and your follow-on, and to all the comrades for their attendance. Now, in order to consider our meeting for next week, is it you, Pam, who's going to talk about it, or Roger? Who wants to talk about the meeting next Sunday?
You want me to do it, Roger? Yeah, Roger, you do it. Yeah, you're going to carry on. Yeah, I'll stop.
Well, we don't quite know. There are two possibilities for next week. One is actually links up very much with the discussion we've had today. A comrade from Pakistan who will talk about the far right in South Asia, which means, and it's something which has been touched on today, which means in Pakistan and probably specifically in India. So that's one possibility. Another is that there is I believe it's still on, a big strike of the Volkswagen workers in Germany, and we may have a speaker, one of the strikers speaking. Both of those are in the pipeline. It's just we don't know which order those two will be in. But please watch your inbox on your emails, and you'll get notice within 2 or 3 days.
Thank you, Roger. So, as always, there'll be a notice circulating about the meeting and advising comrades about the speaker, the topic, and the extent of the discussion. So, with that, we'll close the meeting. So, enjoy the remainder of the evening, and we'll see you all next Sunday at the same time. Okay, comrades.
Thank you.
Small goodbye.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, comrades. Bye-bye.